Noon, evening, morning, wherever you are, and welcome to our webinar today on preparing students for future careers in the changing tech landscape. Today, we're here to discuss how higher education institutions can best prepare their students for the rapidly evolving tech landscape and the careers for the future. Our panel of experts will share their insights on integrating technical skills into curricula, preparing students for the workforce, and encouraging lifelong learning and engagement as technology is rapidly advancing. We hope that you will gain valuable knowledge and best practices on how to navigate this technology landscape, harnessing the power of AI, and prepare students for future career success. So I want to welcome my esteemed panel here today. I'm going to introduce each one of them. First is Laura Longfor. She's our Vice President of Microsoft's Worldwide Learning Organization, where she leads skilling for enterprise customers, partners, academia, and internal employees. So thank you for being here with us, Laura.
Thank you so much,
Next
Melissa.
Is Katie King. Next is Katie King. She is a top 10 AI influencer, published author, and keynote speaker on AI. Katie's second book was published in March of 2022, AI Strategy for Sales and Marketing, Connecting Marketing, Sales, and Customer Service. Thanks for being with us, Katie.
Thanks, Melissa.
And last but not least is Dr. Sean Leahy. He is an internally recognized technologist, futurist, and educator, innovating humanistic approaches to emerging technology in higher education through future studies approach. He is currently the director of the Creative and Emerging Technologies at Arizona State University. Thanks for being with us, Dr. Leahy.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you, Melissa. I'm excited to be here.
Well, we're going to kick this off with a question for everybody, because we know the technology landscape has significantly changed in really just the last 6 months, with really that democratization of AI tools through companies like OpenAI and Microsoft. And so in just this short amount of time, what are some ways that you've already seen higher education positively transform to keep pace with these changes? I'll start with you, Dr. Leahy. What do you think?
Yeah, sure. Well, again, thank you. And just a quick note that, any views expressed here are my own. But yeah, I mean, what a ride we've been on, right? Since the end, essentially the fall of 2022, especially when we consider the advancements and this, like, I've likened it in a paper to like almost a Cambrian explosion of generative AI tools, where there's been a lot of growth for a long period of time, and then just a sudden explosion of these things reaching the market. And, I was thinking about this idea too, of like, how have higher education institutions responded to this in such a short period of time? And it's kind of an interesting component too, because I do think, honestly, with the COVID pandemic, we've sort of learned that sometimes these ground shaking disruptions come quickly with very little time to prepare for it. I think when it comes to things like OpenAI's ChatGPT, for example, you have this space of generative AI that for a long time, going back into even last summer with advancements in DALL-E and some of the image generative AI tools, they weren't quite there yet, right? So you could use them, you could see them, they weren't quite there, but suddenly they got it right with this mixture of the user interface, this chatbot style, and using one of these very impressive large language models that can suddenly, in a literal blink of an eye, start to produce some very interesting outputs. And so, given that sort of sudden reveal or flash in a pan, or however we want to talk about it, I do think the universities have done, broadly speaking, a really good job of trying. There's stories on both ends, right, where you can see there's some reactionary elements, but really thinking about, for the longest time, this sort of AI development, when it happens in educational institutions, is a much slower pace. And so thinking about things that typically move at the speed of university, these are much slower, more methodical changes. And now suddenly it's, spring semester across the world, and everyone is concerned about what are the impacts of things like ChatGPT when it comes to challenging the some of those traditional mechanisms of like the five paragraph essay and things like that. So it's really, in a very short order of time, has really cracked open a decades, if not century long conversation of, let's take a moment to think about how we can best assess our students. What tools are we, how do we actually use these technologies to enhance learning, but also how do we think about this in terms of, does this change the landscape of how we have traditionally done things? So I'll stop talking here in a minute because I want to let everybody else fill in. But overall, I mean, I think I've been fairly impressed with some of the, when we lump everyone together, sort of the measured approach of like, we know we need to make changes. We know that this is not something that's going to go away, but the question is, how do we make those changes, and how do we do that in a responsible manner that, again, and that you'll hear this from me all morning today, how do we do that from a humanistic perspective so that we are empowering our learners, our educators, our faculty, our teachers, and not widening existing pre-existing gaps that have been there before?
Yeah, that's a great point. And I like that you called out kind of, to move forward, we have to kind of go back to the beginning of higher education and fundamentals. I think that sometimes we forget that as bright and new and shiny things come out there. So I really appreciate that approach. Katie, I'll pass it over to you. Same question.
Yeah, I think it's mixed, isn't it? As Sean says, we've seen huge impact, huge opening up in the last few months. And I think we've seen in industry similar sorts of things where some organizations have banned it, some have really embraced it, others are still getting their heads around, what sort of impact is this going to have to make? And I think we have to look at it from a sort of pedagogical point of view. How are we going to use these tools for the actual learning, for education, and then for the universities, the schools, the higher educational establishments, how are we going to use it to enhance our productivity, to enhance the way as organizations we retain our students, we market ourselves to wider students as well. And then, of course, what impact is it having on the curriculum? Are we preparing our young people and our adult learners for the future? So I actually think it's so widespread, but it has come into everybody's consciousness in the last few months. And I think that's the big driver. And I've never been so busy as I am in the last 2 months. And yet I've been doing this with AI for the last 10 years. So it's just exploded. And I think that's a great thing, but it puts quite a lot of pressure on people who now think, wow, we're behind, or how do we handle this from an ethical point of view? And I'm involved in the all-party parliamentary group for AI ethics and the editorial board of the AI and Ethics Journal. So I totally understand how leaders and students are really having to kind of grapple with this big issue of consent and so on. So it's exciting, but it's a worrying time for everybody at the same time.
Yeah. Lots of emotions, it sounds like.
Yeah. Definitely.
Yeah. Laura, how about from your perspective, what are you seeing?
Yeah, sure. At Microsoft, we've got the luxury of looking across industries, right? And so I would say not just higher education, but everyone is grappling with the changes that Sean and Katie alluded to. So whether it's about the rapid pace of technology change, or it's about how to deal with ethics and how we're helping students and educators really think about the full spectrum, because AI is really immersive. It's becoming part of every single thing that we do. And we also know that students are early adopters, right? We definitely see that everybody's been experimenting. They're trying to see how they can use ChatGPT, how they can, if they're in technology themselves, how they can build on OpenAI and kind of have those types of interfaces. And so it is a little bit of like, how do we make sure that we stay in alignment with our students, but also help them as well? Because I think one of the things we're really looking at is taking best practices across the industry and sharing that with higher education so that we can all be learning together. The technology is one thing, as I mentioned, but really thinking about how careers are changing as well. We look at Microsoft across the world of work. And AI is just, it's being infused in every single thing that we do, whether you're doing research or whether you're thinking about how to do a presentation now, or new ways to do data analytics and insights, or engage with our customers differently. So I feel like this coming together of industry and education to really think about how we help our students get most prepared for the future of work is one of the key things that I'm seeing and loving the opportunity in front of us.
I agree with Laura there.
That's
If you don't mind me jumping quickly back in, Melissa. In my first book, there's a whole chapter on AI in education. And at that time, it was so behind, and you had a lot of people, Dame Wendy Hall and others, that were really vocal about it. And I worked closely with them and with Lord Tim Clement Jones over here in the UK. And we have seen change, but the curriculum sometimes lags behind that. But we're seeing the extracurricular side of things really hot up. And I run, and it's pro bono, but it's a Leaders of Tomorrow in Tech program, and Microsoft's been involved in that. And it's really just about, as you know, as Laura just said there, making sure that whatever subject people are studying, they don't just have to be studying data science, IT, AI, you know, computer tech. Whatever subject they're studying, they need to be taught and do their own research and be very resourceful to understand the impact that these types of technologies are going to have on that. And that's both soft and hard skills come into play there as well.
Yeah, I
That's a
think
great
if I
point.
can.
I think
Oh, sorry,
Sean.
Melissa. If I can I'll just tack on to that one last little bit before I probably have to move on. But clearly, you can see the excitement and the energy around this. We could probably talk for the rest of the hour just on the first question. But again, kind of to that point too, right? Like, I think when I think about the response from higher education, right? Like, there is also this. I'll use the term, but I don't hold me to it. This undue burden for educational institutions, right? To sort of separate the commercial availability and the commercial hype around these tools and the affordances and constraints and how that applies to an education or learning environment. And so there's this hard tension there as well, because with something especially like the generative AI tools, like, you know, OpenAI's ChatGPT or whatever, you know, there is this sort of hype cycle that follows those things, as well as those sort of that technology sort of is, you know, diffused across a population. And so often we're met with, you know, everyone, because this became a dinner time conversation, everybody is talking about it. There's also this pressure of, well, why aren't you banning it, or why aren't you using it, right? Are sort of like those two questions. But the reality is, in an educational institution, we have to think very carefully about that too, right? So that we're using these to do those things that those institutions are known for, is preparing, you know, transfer of knowledge and skills, and preparing a new workforce to exist and to thrive and to be innovators and change makers in that society. So it's also combating that sort of rush or gold rush, or this almost knee-jerk responsive reflexive response to either jump on or ban or whatever. But the reality is it's a much more nuanced conversation around. And then even there, right, when we crack into that, context dependent on discipline, fields, ages, all those things apply. But so often it just all gets swept up into the hyperbole around AI this and AI that. And so it's a tough balance. And I think, you know, that's the thing that I know we're doing, and I know all the institutions around the world right now are working towards and working on.
Well, I want to dig a little bit deeper with you, Sean, on that topic of, you know, this hype, but how do you actually bring it into education? And so, you know, with your extensive experience in envisioning and researching innovative technologies and how that really plays with education, kind of within this context, how do you anticipate the utilization of new technologies like AI in preparing students for those future careers? What does this actually, you know, how do you do that?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's tough, right? Because I think it's sort of what I was talking about before, right? Is this idea of, you know, really thinking about what are those practical approaches, really thinking through, like, understanding that it's going to require a sort of a measured approach or a principled approach of what are those contextual awarenesses of that technology, right? Really understanding, one, what is the technology itself? What does it do? But then really thinking deeply and critically about those affordances and constraints, right? And we have lots of models out there. We have TPACK models, we have SAMR, and all these other kind of models about how to integrate technology into teaching. But really, it's idea of really being careful and methodical about that to understand where those things can be best used. For example, right, if we're thinking about something like ChatGPT, I'll just keep using that because it's the one everyone is probably most familiar with. Thinking about anytime there's new technologies like this, right? I often always go back and think, and artificial intelligence and the changes there by themselves are really no different than any other technological change when we kind of take a big step backwards and look at them. And I'm often drawn to Neil Postman's work in the late 90s, where he did a great piece, a presentation around the 5 elements of technological change, right? That all technological change is a trade-off. Some people are going to be advantaged and some people are going to be disadvantaged. And especially when we think about that in an educational context, really understanding, who is it that is going to be disadvantaged by the use of these technology, whether that be general or specific to we're not going to allow students to use it, or we are going to allow students. Because I'll put a pin in it. I'm not going to focus on it now, but even that we can talk about the uneven distribution of access to these tools, right? Which is one of the other pieces, right? So if you have a higher affordance, you are likely to gain access to these tools where others may not. Thinking about things like coming back to Marshall McLuhan's "The medium is the message." So when we start thinking about what new possibilities will this technology sort of unearth or enable that we can really start thinking that we haven't even necessarily thought of yet. Ecological change, right? Once these technologies are there, it's no longer learning and then like plus AI, right? As these tools continue, it'll just be learning and AI will be a part of it. As we continue to progress, we're already seeing that even in just a short period of time is how much it has already started to, and Laura, I think you had mentioned, right, that there are so many elements of artificial intelligence across all these different work forms, whether that it be internal or external or and purely artistic means and things like that. And one of those other pieces when we think about this is like the dangers of any sort of technology becoming mythic. And that's a big one. If you hear me talk about AI in education, you'll hear me talk about this at some point too, is really being careful. So with all technologies, we know this is a common thing where we end up as a society giving over so much more credibility or authority to a technology because it exists and it becomes impressive. And that's a dangerous element to get in, because when that happens, we stop being critical of it. We stop investigating who is making these decisions, who's being left out, are the right people involved to make these decisions. Again, thinking about that humanistic perspective, and are these technologies in any way presenting a harm to our vulnerable populations? Again, who's advantaged, who's disadvantaged, and things like that. But on a more practical level, right? So how do we bring that stuff in, knowing there's all these components around that? Well, for example, like at ASU, one of the things that we just completed in the spring semester, sponsored by the University Provost Office, was to get a webinar panel, webinar series with lots of faculty from different disciplines around the university to bring them together to start having these dialogues openly for students, faculty, and staff to start to investigate these tools, because it's different, perhaps, if we're talking about an entry-level computer science coding course versus a senior level writing composition course. How those tools might be used or integrated, they may represent completely different methodologies. So being very hyper aware of that contextual nature is critical. But also discussing those tough conversations, right? So not trying to create a policy and then push it on people, but have these conversations in a very transparent way to understand how this works by the time it actually filters down into an individual, like whether it be a department or a degree or an individual syllabi for one course, right? And one of the ways that we were doing that is, again, having these webinar series around, one is focusing on the tools, right? So what are these things? What tools are available? How do you get access? How do you use them? but then also really thinking about the culture. So from a university perspective, changing the conversation from that sort of hyperbolic existential threat kind of polarizing conversation and really moving towards fostering a positive culture around the use of those tools, knowing those aren't going to go away. They're going to change, modify, and continue to evolve, yes, but they're not going to disappear. And so really kind of working on that, like like asking the tough questions internally and having those conversations internally with the institution. How do we think generative AI tools are going to impact things like academic integrity? Right? There's always this threat, oh, everyone's going to use it just to cheat. Well, and that's a very dangerous thing, right? Because when we talk about that, that puts automatically this deficit mindset that technology is used to get around sort of a cat and mouse. I'm going to, do something. And that's not the idea here. The idea here is to have those positive conversations around it, to understand when would these sort of tools be most beneficial or appropriate to use, and how do we leverage that, both from the faculty and from the student side. And then moving beyond today, right? Thinking about and critically examining what do we think the long-term impacts will be using things like generative AI on critical thinking? How does it change research? How does it change what graduate students or faculty or in professional researchers, whether they be in higher ed or in industry, how does it change the way that they will approach these things? And how do we as consumers of that information become more critical to think about what it is we're seeing? Right? Of course, obviously the writing, but a big piece too is coming back always to this idea of social justice and diversity, equity, and inclusion. How do we make sure that these tools are being used in a positive way, in the sense that we think about, we can't avoid all harms, right? But how do we navigate and identify those things so that we understand what those affordances and constraints of using those are?
I think you called out some really important points for the acceleration of AI in education and in learning specifically, how it impacts students, faculty, staff, everyone in all different ways, which is really important for us to think about as we kind of continue to consume, use, integrate, and move forward with these technologies. And so maybe I want to shift over to Laura for a second, because we've kind of focused on the learning. I want to focus on more of that workforce aspect that you talked about in the beginning. And so maybe from your perspective as a worldwide leader who really is partnering closely with education from an industry perspective, what are some of those top skilling trends that you're seeing in the tech industry for both current and new employees, specifically around AI?
Yeah, thanks, Melissa. I would say when I think about what's changing in the learning environment from a corporate learning and development side, I think about it two ways. I think there's the content. So what are we needing to learn about? And so when you think of artificial intelligence, there's this whole plethora of capabilities that we were talking about, things like the ChatGPT, but also how to build intelligent applications and that type of thing. So that's kind of the content side that we are definitely seeing trends. So more and more and more people looking for help me learn about the capabilities of these technologies and how we can most effectively use it. There's also surrounding content things like ethics that we've been talking about as well. That is definitely a trend in the what people want to learn. But then I would also talk just a minute about in corporate learning and development, how we're learning and how we're helping students learn, or how we're helping folks that are already in the workforce learn as well, is also changing. I'd say one of the big trends that we're seeing there is getting very skills-based focused. And so what I mean by that is very targeted. It's less about the knowledge and broad information type training. It's very specific to the types of skills that we need for the job that you're doing today, or you're preparing to do today if you're a student. And so, like, for example, I lead a lot of training within Microsoft for our own Salesforce, right? And earlier, Katie was talking about like some of those softer skills. I actually like to prefer to call them power skills, but a skills-based learning. One of the things that we're working on training for our own Salesforce today is micro skills, like things like insightful listening, That's a power skill, right? If you're a seller and you can build this skill-based capability, that's going to help you be more effective in your role. So we're seeing with these skill-based learning opportunities to leverage AI to assess where people are today and then help them build those skills, whether they're the soft power skills or more technical skills as well, getting very focused on the skills-based learning. The other thing I would talk about that is kind of hand in hand related to that is around micro-credentialing. And it goes hand in hand with these very targeted skills. So what we're seeing this trend happening is instead of doing role-based certifications or to augment role-based certifications, getting very specific around a particular type of technology or skill that you might need, and then getting badging and credentialing around that. So in the AI space, things like how do we help folks that are needing to learn how to do cognitive services, for example, or natural language processing. And so they can be very, very targeted for this micro-credentialing thing. So so I'd say kind of the trends we're seeing across industry, and obviously this is brought back into higher education as well, because we want to prepare our students effectively that once they get into the workforce, they can continue to build these skills-based profiles and continuously be looking at how do they credential and have that curiosity and build that growth mindset and that learner's mindset to continue to build and be effective as they go throughout their careers.
I think that that's wonderful, because that's kind of that heart of higher education, and we're seeing that as the momentum to continue forward, even as these emerging technologies and disruptive technologies even are coming into play. That still is the driving force of higher education. So I'm glad to hear that that is what you're seeing and what Microsoft is really pushing forward. And so I want to shift over to Katie for a second. You talked about a few things in the beginning, some of the work that you're doing. You work a lot across a lot of these different industries, kind of permeated into them. And I find it very interesting, you know, because I think, you know, I've read your book, and it really talks a lot about like all companies are tech companies now, and really all jobs are tech jobs now. And so how do we kind of support that? And, you know, AI being infused to all of these different industries and how it's kind of everywhere. And really, it's affecting our students for their future careers, because they're the ones who are going to be doing that in the future. But Laura kind of touched on it with this balance of, you know, how do we kind of bring in these cutting edge technical skills while still developing those critical thinking and soft skills? How have you seen that most effective in higher education, in industry? What are some of the pointers that you can give around that?
Yeah, it's such an interesting space, isn't it? And, you know, to Laura's point too, one of my main messages to everybody, whether it's a student, whether it's a, you know, a captain of industry, is that we are all on this journey of continuous learning. We can't sit back on our laurels. And for me, that's really democratizing. You don't have to be 40 or 50 or 60. You don't need gray hair and gravitas. You can come in at a young age, or you can reskill at a more advanced age with the right tools, and the playing field is much more equal. So that really resonated with me there, Laura. But to Melissa's question specifically, I think it's really important for educators to understand that technology will actually impact careers and industries, you know, across the board, every single industry, but that there are a lot of misconceptions that the AI is the big shiny robot coming and taking all of these jobs, and that we've all got to therefore go and learn to code or have really advanced technical skills. And that's not the case. I think, you know, in a few years' time, we probably won't even be talking about AI. We don't talk about how our smartphones work. We just know that they're at our side and they're indispensable. You know, it's what we're having to really focus in on is how these tools, and I'm, you know, on the one hand, it might be robotic process automation, natural language processing, this family of AI under which we have the generative AI, the visual and the various text-based tools, the, you know, text-to-speech conversion, the chatbots. We've got all of these different things, but what they're doing is reshaping the way that we work. And it doesn't require all of us to have the hard technical skills. But I mean, Laura talked about power skills. You know, I still think of them as soft skills, but I love that phrase. You know, what we're saying is this AI is shaping and reshaping whether we are an educator, whether we're a barrister, a medical doctor, whatever we are. There are now a raft of tools that can help us. I call it the 3Ds, the dirty, the dull, and the dangerous, you know, to sort of take away some of the drudgery, to give us crystal insights. You know, for example, in some industry sectors, for many years, banking, I'm thinking, and retail, has been a lot of guesswork. And we've treated our consumer or our client in a very homogenous way. And so I think the deep granular insights that the AI can give us across every industry sector is really, really important. But what that therefore means is that the AI can do certain things, but it can't do the deep strategy. It can't do the deep personalization. It can't do the real true creativity. And so we mustn't be overlooking those skills and thinking everybody's got to go away and learn to code and you know, do a degree or a PhD in AI. So I think it's kind of that balance of recognizing that this generation is more technologically savvy than me, the parent and the grandparent, but we can all learn. But they intuitively know how to play with and to use technology. And I think that's the key. So the resourcefulness, the strategy, the you know, all of those different skills that the World Economic Forum, for example, states that we're all going to need in the next coming years are the fundamentals. And I think that balancing act is really, really important for higher education to instill in students, teaching them how is AI reshaping fashion and construction and the law, and if you as a student want to become an educator. So there's that side to it. And then us as educators, how do we also use it for the teaching and learning? And we're all doing business functions of finance, HR, marketing. It's shaping those business functions too. So for me, it's very multifaceted and it's a balancing act.
I like that. AI is making us more human and able to focus on those human sides of us that maybe we didn't have the ability or the time or space to do before. And
exactly, and that's the paradox, isn't it? That is the paradox, that it does make us more human because it gives us insights that enable us as an educator to give a blended learning session to people of all different abilities and languages, you know, with the right tools. But it doesn't mean that teacher lecturer is redundant.
Exactly. I think that's a beautiful statement. And you know, we kind of focused in up here, and there's a lot of innovation. There's a lot going on in this world right now. Obviously, there's a lot going on, specifically around AI in higher education, in every industry, in skilling, in all of it. But I want to kind of go a little bit deeper with each of you on, you know, practical advice for our audience on how do we get there? Or what is the first step? What is even the next step? Because some of us are just trying to baby step our way into tomorrow with all of the announcements and all of the tech swirling around us. So I want to start out with you, Sean, and dig a little bit into that. What are some of those practical steps that institutions can take to maybe better prepare for the implementation of these emerging technologies? You talked about some of the lecture series that you're having, involving students in those conversations, maybe even go into what are some of those recommendations that you might have for faculty to implement some of these technical skilling, training, and certification into their existing curriculum.
Yeah, sure. So I think, you know, I'll also just kind of building off a little bit of what Katie had just kind of responded in the last bit. I love the plug for the World Economic Forum, because a lot of futures thinking and a lot of futures work comes out of there with Klaus Schwab. And So I think what I'll try to answer this question by sort of thinking about it in terms of, and if you remember from my bio, you heard all this stuff about like future studies and futures thinking and all this kind of stuff. And, so really kind of thinking about that because it applies to artificial intelligence in very much the same way it applies to any emergent technology, right? And kind of thinking about when we start this, and this is not new to this sudden onslaught of, or this gold rush, if you will, of artificial intelligence and where we need to use it and how we need to use it. But thinking more broadly about it in terms of an innovation / disruption that's happening, right? And one of the things that can be very valuable, and this is something that I've been pushing for a long time, is really thinking about how to bake in elements of futures thinking across the curriculum. So when I say across the curriculum, I mean across the curriculum, right? So whatever discipline or context that you're learning in, whether it be professional or through formative years of education and things like that, it can apply. And really thinking about futures thinking and what it is, right? This is a skill set. And so for those of you who may not be familiar with the term and haven't really heard it before, sometimes the easiest way to describe what it is to describe what it is not. And what it is not is predicting the future. What it is a mindset and philosophy based on the broader academic discipline around future studies. But it is essentially the act of evaluating emerging global trends and informing strategic plans to handle future uncertainties, right? So whether we're talking about the disruption of artificial intelligence in higher education or in K-12 or in the banking industry, right? Or whatever, that really one of the practical ways we can do that is to start thinking about intentionally thinking about these future states. What does it mean when this new tool comes into my ecosystem, right? Again, I'll build on the kind of what I was talking about before, this idea of these technology changes are, I would argue, they are ecological changes, right? The entire environment changes as a result of their presence being in there. These aren't things that you can just add and then remove and have things go back to the way they were. And so really thinking about that, right? That if we can engage in elements of futures thinking, right? That what we're doing is we're really, again, taking this intentional and purposeful act of thinking about those possible futures. And we don't have time in this webinar to dive in all the things about what are all those possible futures and stuff. But if anyone is interested in that, just literally Google future studies and futures thinking and possible futures. There's so much out there. But essentially what we can do is we can start to envision what do these multiple futures look like. Making connections with the past to even present. How did we get where we are today? What changes that took place? What did things happen? Even from just our technological landscape today, why are we using technology the way we are, right? There's a lot of criticisms with how we are leveraging globally, right? How we're leveraging online learning, that even an online learning LMS platform in in a digital format is locking us into some of the most traditional mechanisms of a learning environment that have not shown a lot of growth or change over X number of years, right? So thinking about those things, how did we get to where we are today? And so to answer one of those questions that I like to pose is like, why would adding futures thinking components into any curriculum, any area be of value, right? What impact can that have when we're exploring an emergent technology? Well, one, I mean, it is a core competency of the UNESCO SDG 4 for sustainable education, right? So how do we think about building these things going beyond just, again, that reflexive reaction to something that has now suddenly taken the world by storm, right? What does it mean to actually use these in our classrooms? It enables our learners to explore complex and very ill-defined challenges, right? Getting them to think critically about this change, even as an exercise. So these are some things like when we think about some of those practical tools or practical tips, is even as a faculty with your students, engaging your students to ask them, how is the use of ChatGPT or WordTune or some other tool, right? How is that changing the way that we're learning to write? And have those conversations openly, because I think there's a common pitfall of when we are in the position of an educator, for example, there's this in my opinion, an undue pressure to know everything, and that our students, that we're just transferring knowledge to our students. In many ways, one of the most transformative learning experiences is learning along with, right? Demonstrating the power of seeking that information together rather than just you sit there, I will tell you. And I think, especially in a case like, I mean, that's true when we talk about teaching coding principles to educators who are not computer scientists, right? There's often this insecurity of I'm not a coder, but I'm going to teach my students how to code. That, you know, but it's learning how to learn along with, right? And that can be very powerful, especially with something like generative AI tools. These have been, ChatGPT has been in people's hands since essentially late 2022. The chances of that, I mean, you look at just the normal syllabi development process, that's instant. That's today, right? So how does someone already an expert on that? Or even how does somebody in, like, for example, humanities understand what that tool is even doing to be able to accurately assess how they're going to use it in their classroom, and things like that. So that's where these kind of tools, these futures thinking tools, really can really come in. By using them, right, it can strengthen creative problem solving and critical thinking skills, foster social and environmental responsibility, thinking about what are those long terms. Again, if you're using this, thinking about yourself as a student, an activity that I love to do with students or even in professional development settings is to work on a 30-year time scale, right? So 30-year time scale is roughly, right, depending on where you live in the world, roughly the age of a career. But to think about when you enter your career, what tools and technologies do you need today? And then thinking about that 30 years from now, what do you think you'll need? And one of those really interesting ways is to kind of, again, do that backwards look. Today, right, you have these skill sets. What did that same job require 30 years previous, if it even existed, right? What did that job require? And to think about what has changed in that time frame, right? Keeping in mind the iPhone and things like that has only been here since 2006. 2007, right? And so what does that mean? What can change? And then to thinking about those and thinking about those elements, because one of those things that it can do that I think is be incredibly valuable for the future workforce is that it can reduce future shock, right? This idea of by enabling learners to see and perceive change and uncertainty as the norm, right? They begin to learn how to see these trends, see these new technological developments coming, and start thinking about all those things critically. Right? If this comes to fruition, how is that going to change? You know, maybe you're a student somewhere and you're studying art history, right? Or I don't know, I'm just making it up on the fly, right? But now you're thinking, well, how is my profession going to change as a result of image generative AI tools? They're winning art competitions, you know, from here and there and whatever. Does that change what it means? Will we become more human, right, as a result of that? Or does it present a different way of thinking about this process of even what does it mean to create, right? And so really thinking about that. And with the hope that it fosters hope and not fear by being active participants about thinking about these technologies and sort of approaching them as they have ownership and where this future goes with these tools, and not just like you will be told what you can and cannot use. And to be clear about that, like there might be certainly reasons like writing courses, you can use it for generating ideas and to be like a writing partner. However, what's not expected is that you can just type in a prompt and copy paste and you're done. That's probably not going to fly, right? But what could fly is you might type something up and say, give me 3 more versions of this and let me sort of pick and evaluate which one I think is better. Which one do I think gets the point across or is a better performance of my understanding and things like that. And so, yeah, so really, I think a lot of those pieces in terms of, so thinking about it practically, I think it's going to be very context dependent, but I think one of the most powerful things you can do is have that conversation in a transparent and open way. So if you're in a class and you're saying, I'm going to forbid technology A, B, or C, also with an explanation of why. Or I would encourage you to use XYZ, here's how, and stuff like that. And to really kind of, again, have that conversation with people, including the students into those conversations. So there's an understanding with how can they lean into those future uncertainties as well as, because this is the new disruption right now, but it is not going to be the last. And as we enter into the 4th industrial revolution, these will only come faster and faster and farther or something, so.
I appreciate that. And I think there's so many amazing points that you called out in there, but that idea of teaching students across the curriculum about that futurist thinking to prepare them for the future. Not that they are predicting the future, but that change is constant and they need to be able to adapt in any sort of environment to that change. And that is going to be so powerful for students. It's not teaching them AI, it's teaching them how to adapt, how to change, how to evaluate these tools as they come out. It's a really fantastic way to think about it, not one that I've thought about before. So I really appreciate you bringing that up, Sean. And so I want to shift over to Laura for a second and kind of talk about, maybe some of those teaching and learning resources that Microsoft has. You talked about micro-credentialing before, and there was actually an audience question about that. And so I want to dig into a little bit more about, what are some of the resources and support that Microsoft can provide faculty to ensure they're equipped to teach those technical skills and incorporate them into courses, whether they be micro learning opportunities, badges, certificate. What are all the things that Microsoft has? There's a lot out there.
We could be here all day, Melissa, if I told you all the things. But I think I'd want to start by saying we recognize in higher education that your faculty really are the experts on your curriculum. And so what we really want to do is partner together to infuse our technical skilling into the curriculum and work together as a partner to help with the future of education. We think that that's kind of our strategy and our approach to help the students as they prepare for effective careers moving forward, and build some of those skills that Sean talked about, like lifelong learning. How do you build that skill, right? That is a skill to make sure that everybody thinks about lifelong learning. So we definitely want to partner together on infusing our curriculum. We have a whole number of resources that are available today. For educators, we've got a program that we call Microsoft Learn for Educators, and it really is completely geared towards integrating some of our certification, our learning paths on all of our various technologies, from AI to every other platform that we have available, and integrating that into your core curriculum for your students today. We also have programs where we are working on connecting students to career opportunities. So once you've demonstrated expertise in a particular area, we do a little bit of matchmaking, right, within the tech industry for people that are looking for the specific skills that students have just developed. And so that's another key area. And I think to go back on the micro-credentialing, and just broadly our certification programs, those are readily available today. We have all of our technical skilling is available on Microsoft Learn, and that's skilling paths, it's our credentials, it's ways that we can integrate into the curriculum like we talked about. And that is also where you're going to see micro-credentialing coming up as well, for all technologies, not just artificial intelligence, but of course that will be a big focus for us given all the attention on it right now. So those are a handful of the resources I would talk about. We have a whole bunch more, but I think just from a time perspective, I'll keep it at that today.
That's wonderful. And we'll get to learn about more in some of your sessions coming up during Microsoft Build. Is that correct?
Oh, that's true. We have a big event going on for our developers today called Microsoft Build. I will tell you, it is even for me a little overwhelming at the volume of technology that is coming out. And of course, we need to respond from a training perspective and a skilling perspective. So very excited about Microsoft Build today. You will see probably a ton of announcements if you're looking on LinkedIn or you're following the tech industry, but couldn't be more excited about the opportunities ahead, and definitely more resources coming to support that technology.
That's fantastic to hear, because I know the first thing that I did when I learned that there was some sort of generative AI in there, I went right to Microsoft Learn and I said, I need to know about this. So that's where I did all of my training. So I appreciate y'all helping me and a lot of educators through this. So, well, Katie, I want to end with a very difficult question for you because we've talked about a lot of amazing things, practical steps, but we know not everybody's really excited about AI and moving forward with AI in higher education, or just even embraced it as an individual. And so from your perspective, what are some of those recommendations that you might have for higher education leaders specifically and faculty that maybe haven't taken this leap yet? How do we embrace the AI, the change? Oh, you're on mute. Sorry.
Apologies. The dog barked and I forgot to unmute. So it's a great question, and I get asked it a lot from captains of industry, educators, and so on. And I think now, honestly, we have to be saying, if you don't upskill, if you don't start to take advantage of some of these tools, you will get left behind. Had we been talking a year, 2 years ago, it might be a different answer. And so I think we now have enough examples. We now have enough vendors out there. We have frameworks being developed, acts, EU and other US and other regulations starting to come together. So I think it would be wrong now to sort of sit back and continue to bury your head in the sand. But what that doesn't mean is that everybody out there is adopting it at scale. I'm not pretending for one moment that is the case. For both my books and for my ongoing work, which is daily consulting and learning and hearing evidence all around the world in the House of Lords, I develop intellectual property, and on my website I've got, and it's aiinbusiness.co.uk, I've got a free scorecard, and it's a scorecard for success. And to Sean's point earlier about different technological developments and even business disruptions like COVID, it's a really useful guide. And so what it does, and I won't go through every bit of it, conscious of time, but it's a scorecard where people can understand, do we have the right mindset for change? Do we have the buy-in from the management team? Have we developed a business case? Are we experimenting and doing proofs of concept? Are we collaborating as different departments? Because this technology is impacting HR, like I said earlier, the marketing, the pedagogical side of it. Do we have the talent? Do we need to buy that in? Do we need to upskill? How is it impacting our culture? And what's the wider impact from an ethical point of view, and what's our roadmap? So it's got these 10 areas. You can go away, you can gamify it with your teams, you can give yourself a score and work out, are we too traditional, or are we now starting to transition? And at what point do we need to be transformational? So I think the message really is there, don't wait. We are past the innovation trigger. We've gone across the hump of the hype and so on. We have dropped down into the trough of disillusionment, and we are starting, we're not there, but we're starting to reach that plateau of productivity. So now is the time. It's not literally really, really early days. We are further down the track, and these tools are making major impact across the world in higher education and in other industry sectors as well.
I think that's a great message, is just to get started. There are those that have went before you, so don't be scared. There's skilling, there's amazing experts like Sean out there and Katie who are leading the way. Now's the time. I think that's a really important message to kind of leave with our audience is, let's get started today. Don't wait. There's resources, there's support, there's people, there's websites, there's art, there is everything you could ever want out there for you to get started. So I just think that was a great point to leave us with, Katie. Thank you for that. And I think that the importance behind that is very much heard. So I appreciate that very much. But I want to leave us maybe with one final question for today for everybody on our panel, because we talked a lot about, AI today, AI tomorrow, who knows where we'll be in a year. And so let's say we have this panel again in a year, next year, this day next year. what's one important trend that you think we'll be talking about related to AI in education, or maybe not, Sean? I don't know. So Sean, let's start with you. What do you think?
Yeah. So first of all, I would just +1 and endorse everything Katie just said. And I'll end with that too, a call to action. But yeah, so okay, so let's move. I just marked it down. So next year, May 23rd, 2024, ready to go. You know, I hope at this point we fast forward a year. I think AI will have moved into, we're not talking about prompt engineering anymore because it's just part of what we're doing. Personally, I hope that we'll be past that, again, that polarizing conversation of, existential crisis and the end of X as we know it, and into a more productive state. As Katie mentioned, I love, my favorite part of the hype cycle is the Trough of Disillusionment. It has a great name, also a great band name. If anyone, I don't know if anyone's ever taken that, but but that's a very important part because that is the cold water to the hype, that everything is like panic, panic, panic. It's like, no, it won't do all the things it was promised to do, but over the long tail, it will do a lot of really amazing things. But we need to be moving up to that, sort of like that plateau of productivity. Where will it actually be of value, and how will it actually change the things that we're doing? So I hope that's kind of where we are a year from now, is that we're not talking anymore about the industries that will be, all the jobs that will be replaced by AI, because I'm personally in the belief that that is not what's going to happen. But I think Katie, I believe it was you. I think maybe you and Laura had kind of hinted at this. It won't be replaced by AI, but you'll be replaced by people or businesses that are leveraging and using AI, right? As that sort of skill and tool set. But the other piece I really hope that we have out there, and this is just kind of a quick call to the policymakers globally, right? With technological transformations, this is nothing new with AI. It usually far outpaces any regulatory or policy components. And with something like generative AI, we do have some serious issues around privacy and data, where it's getting it, even copyright information and copyright, these have not been settled. And so I do hope a year from now, we also have some more defined guardrails that will help higher education institutions know where they should be placing some boundaries and things like that. And just call to action. I think the best time, there's no time like today. If you haven't been playing with these tools, play with them. Your context and your industry better than anyone. Play with these things. Can it actually do anything? And if it does, what? Play with it. Play with those tools.
Katie, what about you? What trends are you thinking about a year from today?
I would like to see us sharing incredible case studies of successes that we've all had. And I agree with Sean. I think we will be revisiting some of the legalities, around data privacy and rights of access and fair use and intellectual property. That I definitely think we would have on our agenda. I'd like to think, and this is being really hopeful, that we could have agenda items that are now, like I said earlier, pushing away the dirty, dull, and dangerous and monotonous, freeing us up to have bigger conversations about purpose-driven activities. So we're teaching our students to go into education or into any other industry. And if AI is fully exploited, we can potentially crack some of the big issues of the moment around sustainability and disease and poverty and inclusion and so on. So it would be great to be having, have freed up some time in the curriculum and in the way that we learn, and changing the curriculum and what we teach to be talking around exploiting some of these tools from a purpose-driven perspective.
Wonderful. Laura, what about you? A year from today, what trends?
Yeah, a year from today, I'm trying to put on my 30-year hat, but I'll back up to 1 year and basically say I'm super passionate about the learner experience itself. And I'm hoping a year from today, we are down the path on hyper personalization for learning. So really thinking about what the individual needs are for everybody, looking at assessments and how people can identify what they need to learn, and then really serving up the appropriate learning opportunity and then reinforcing that so they can continuously be learning. So I'm hoping a year from now, we're down the path on hyper-personalization.
Well, I, for one, am excited about our webinar next year to talk about these topics. So thank you so much for joining us today, to our audience for participating, asking thoughtful questions, and to our panelists for providing amazing information for all of us just to kind of better prepare and be knowledgeable about this topic, because we know that this landscape is evolving rapidly around us. So I hope that everyone takes our call to action today to start today, like Katie King says, and we're looking forward to continuing this conversation. Thanks, everybody.